In 1769, Daniel Boone braved his way through the Cumberland Gap, paving a path to Kentucky. Many consider him a hero, but was he also a liar? There are many outlandish stories from Kentucky's past. Today, we'll try to find any hint of truth in them on Expedition Kentucky. I recently learned about two unbelievable stories from Kentucky's past. There's a story about Daniel Boone encountering a giant hairy creature that he called a Yahoo, a term associated with Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Is it possible that Daniel Boone encountered a Bigfoot? I'm here with
Jim Seaver, the Community Engagement Coordinator at the Kentucky Historical Society.
And Jim, how do we know the information on this sign is true?
So if you look at today's historical marker program, we do our best to rigorously fact check every bit of data that goes on the markers. And my predecessors in previous generations of the program did the same. That being said, we know once in a blue moon, sometimes a piece of data will end up on a marker that more recent research has shown us is not necessarily as accurate as we would like, but in the long term we are very much committed to getting the story straight.
And what places did Boone travel to or live? Did he live here in Kentucky?
He sure did, and what's so interesting, right now we are standing at Daniel Boone's grave in the Frankfort Cemetery, but there is no evidence at all that he ever lived in Frankfort or spent any significant amount of time here in this area. He traveled extensively throughout the state. In fact, that's probably what his biggest claim to fame is. And not only did he travel extensively, he was one of the earliest Anglo-American explorers in Kentucky. If you look at his life story as a young man in the 1760s, he starts making expeditions up through the Cumberland Gap and slowly but surely piecing together his own mental map of central Kentucky at that time.
We do know that Daniel Boone was a hunter. While on his long hunts, what was he doing?
When he would come in on these hunting expeditions in the late 1760s, early 1770s, he was collecting animal pelts from game that he had shot and taking those back east and selling them. We know that at least on two occasions when he met up with various Shawnee warrior parties, the members of the Shawnee tribe actually confiscated the pelts from him, sent him back east, and warned him that this probably wasn't the wisest place to be exploring during that time.
We know that Daniel Boone references Gulliver's Travels many times. Would you say that he named Lulbegrud Creek after that book?
So according to legend, Daniel Boone and the other members of his hunting party were reading Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift during one of their hunting expeditions. And according to legend, they were reading a section where the protagonist is moving through the capital of the giants, and supposedly around that time they encounter a band of Native Americans. Daniel Boone and his compatriots fall silent, and after the Native Americans move on, supposedly one of his colleagues said, well, we've been saved from the Lulbegrubs, or something to that effect. They laughed about it, the name stuck, and by the time the name got jotted down on the map, it had a new spelling compared to what Jonathan Swift had written in his book.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
It seems that Daniel Boone and his companions were definitely fans of Gulliver's Travels. Perhaps that's where the Yahoo story comes from. Next, we'll look at another far-fetched story from Kentucky's past. Let's meet back with Alyssa at the Kentucky Historical Society to examine the journal of Thomas Ashe, who claims to have discovered mummies underneath Lexington. Thanks for having me back to the library.
Hi, yeah, welcome back. Welcome to our research library.
How accurate is Thomas Ashe's discovery of mummies in Lexington?
Yeah, so in front of you, you actually have his account of his travels in America. This is published in the early 19th century, and this is the page here right in front of you where he talks about finding the Lexington catacomb for the first time. He was actually very famous for making things up, so he frequently plagiarized his accounts. There's one incident where he actually stole several $1,000s worth of mammoth bones from a guy in Cincinnati by dressing up and pretending to be a French scientist. So he's not exactly the most reliable source for this story. So probably not accurate. Nobody in the last 220 years has found these caves or has told a similar story. Everybody comes back and just cites his account, so it's probably not accurate.
Right. What does this say about the perception of Native American cultures and their burial practices?
Yeah, so he is buying into a kind of prevailing theory at the time that claimed that there was kind of a race of indigenous people who they kind of call them the mound builders. They're responsible for these earthworks, these ancient settlements that people found all across the country when kind of white settlers came to the area. But there was a prevailing theory that those people couldn't have been possibly related to the Native Americans that the settlers were encountering in the 18th century. It was a very prejudiced belief. They were kind of believing that the mound builders were sophisticated and civilized, whereas in their wrong opinion, the Native Americans they were encountering were, primitive and savage was the word that they used. So there's kind of some crazy theories in here. Thomas talks about how they could be ancient Egyptians who sailed to the United States, or ancient Chinese people who walked across the Bering Land Bridge. There's even a theory that it was the lost tribes of Israel from the Old Testament who built all this stuff. So he goes into all this detail. But of course, all those theories are wrong, and so modern archaeologists now understand that these people who built the ancient earthworks are the ancestors of kind of Native Americans that we see in the 18th century and then today.
So I noticed you also pulled this. What is this?
Yeah, so we're talking about how kind of the ancient Native Americans are related to the Native Americans of the 18th and 19th century. So this is one of the most famous rare books about Native American history that we have. This is one of our kind of prized possessions here at the Kentucky Historical Society. It's called The History of the Indian Tribes of North America. It was published in the 1830s, and it's really important because it contains real pictures of real Native people who lived in the United States in the 1830s. So they would travel to Washington, D.C. to negotiate with the federal government, and the organizers of this book would have their paintings taken, and then those paintings got turned into lithographic portraits that you see here. They're really cool because they're super detailed and they're really colorful. And so as you page through the book, you get to see kind of different examples of different tribes and their different clothing and their accessories and the way that they look and different things. And then each picture is accompanied by a biography. So you can actually learn more about these real individuals who did live in the United States.
Do we know of any stories of giants in Kentucky?
Well, in terms of giants, so one theory for Thomas's story is that we have found mummified remains of Native Americans since his account, but they're in much drier caves. So in Short Cave, Kentucky, we've actually found the remains of Native Americans that had been mummified by the cave environment, but they're of normal stature. They're not giant at all. They're kind of normal human size. There were two men who were, I guess, considered giant in Kentucky in the 19th century. So you have Martin Van Buren Bates and then Jim Porter were two men who reached almost 8 feet tall during their life, but mostly probably because of a congenital deformity, not because they were of any kind of ancient different race or something like that. They're very normal men. They had jobs. Martin Van Buren Bates served in the Confederate Army, and he actually married a woman named Anna who was also 8 feet tall. So their story is pretty interesting, but again, they're just kind of normal humans like me and you.
After talking with Alyssa, Thomas Ashe may not be the most trustworthy source. There may be no mummies underneath Lexington. So what were real American Indian burials like? We'll meet with another expert from the Kentucky Heritage Council to learn more. Hi, I'm Greg Meyer.
I'm Tressa Brown.
And what do you do?
I work for the Kentucky Heritage Council. My title is Historic Preservation Coordinator, and I coordinate 3 different state commissions, the African American and Native American Heritage Commissions and the Martin Luther King State Commission.
So Tressa, what do we know about Native American burials?
Folks were buried in a variety of ways through time. Some of them were buried in mounds, some of them weren't. Some of them were buried in stone kind of coffins that were limestone slabs, in the ground, and then the body put in. and then limestone slabs put on top. Some of them were buried without that. Some of them were fully laid out in length. Some of them were curled up, fetal position. So it's lots of different ways, which to me means that lots of different cultural values were in place. So different cultures, not just Indian people, all generic. They're not generic.
Right. What types of encounters was Daniel Boone having with Native Americans during this time, or Thomas Ashe? What types of encounters are they having?
Daniel Boone had a variety because he engaged with Shawnee and the Cherokee, and some of that had to do with he was a poacher in this land because this was Shawnee land. He was here illegally, and they caught him at it. And the material that he had collected, all the hides that he had collected, they said, you're poaching, this is our stuff, you go on your way. He was captured a number of times, he was chased a number of times. So he had friendly relations with some of the tribes and some of the bands of the tribes, and sometimes not so friendly. Right. So again, varied responses depending on what he was doing.
Do you think this changed the perception that we have on Native Americans today?
No, because I think that the main story of Daniel Boone is like the frontiersman, Indian fighter kind of guy. And even though there are the stories where he had friendly relations, he was a family member essentially, an adopted family member of Native peoples, that story kind of butts heads with his frontiers, running from the Indians, shooting, and all of the stuff that, all the TV shows and stuff that we've seen. So I don't think that it's done too much for actual understanding of Native people today.
Right. Thank you. So it seems that Daniel Boone is a bit of a storyteller, and Thomas Ashe was a flat-out con man. But we learn that Kentucky's natives lived and established cultural traditions in Kentucky thousands of years before either of the white men stepped foot in the bluegrass. You never know what secrets you can uncover on Expedition Kentucky.